Hey everyone, good afternoon, good evening, or maybe even good morning, depending on where you may be in the world. Um, so for those of you who don't know me, my name's Chris. I'm the Canadian product specialist for Yamaha Line 6 and Ampeg here in Canada. And today is yet another Line 6 live stream. Today we'll be focused on PodGo. We'll be looking at different presets that I've made, exploring different concepts, and maybe tips and tricks, if you will, on preset building with PodGo because it includes its share of fixed blocks and limitations, but not in a bad way. So more on that a bit later. The topic for today will mostly be about around high gain settings, but not necessarily in the way that one might think. When we think of high gain nowadays, it's super like metal or extreme music, stuff like that. But you'll see with my different presets today that high gain can mean something else by exploring different tricks and going for different eras in time where high gain didn't share the same definition as today. So a good segue to that is from a comment from Blake here saying, "Awesome, this is for us metalheads this time." While it will cover some grounds for metal, it won't all be about that. I'm going to try to be all around, even though the title says high gain. So yeah, we'll just go over some concepts, some tricks with PodGo, and we'll play some sounds and go over those presets. So let me just switch views here so you get PodGo edit like so. And my first preset for today will be covering the more traditional high gain basses. This preset is based around the 2204 amp model, which is basically an 80s British amp. So at the very beginning of the modern, if you will, high gain era, if that makes any sense. So not exactly super tight, not exactly super high gain, but we'll go over some tricks that they did back in the days to add some gain to those amp when they needed to push them. So quick bass sound, 2204. As you can see on PodGo Edit here, it's at a fairly low setting for drive. The rest EQ is just personal taste, and the volume is fairly high up, so you can get a bit of power amp saturation, if you will. So just a quick snippet of that. See, so that's what I would call crunchy, but it's not super tight and it's not that gainy either. So makes for a good starting point. So the cab that I used today with that amp, I tried to be kind of period correct, if you will. So I used a 412 with greenback speakers. Since the 2204 is a fairly bright amp in itself, I went for the 4038 ribbon mic because it's a kind of rounder sounding mic, kind of darker, pretty much on the edge of the cap here. Then if we go down those settings here, you can see the angle is at 0 degrees, so traditional, and then I put my personal low and high cut settings. That's a matter of taste, but usually that's the ballpark where I'm happy with. So around 90 hertz for low cut, so it doesn't get too flubby in the bass, and then a high cut around 7 kilohertz to tame some of those really fizzy kind of highs, right? So I felt like that was a decent pairing for that amp. Obviously, if you think 80s British kind of amps like that, when they needed more gain, what they did is just add an overdrive because they were around then. So I went for another kind of classic pairing for this one with the Stuper Ori here. And a neat trick with those instead of just adding tons of drive, you turn it all the way down almost, and then tone is once again a matter of preference, and then you crank the level all the way up. So it doesn't really color the tone of the amp as much, rather than just pushing the front end and really make the amp cook. So I'll just play a few chords without that overdrive, so we can remind ourselves of the bass sound that we were going for. See, kind of flubby in the low end here, and then I'm gonna add this one here. See, so it's way tighter, but it didn't really affect the bass tone of the amp, if that makes any sense. Didn't add too much of the pedals color to it because we didn't push that overdrive circuit, rather than just sending a bunch of volume to the front of the amp. So that's a neat trick to push your amp without changing the bass tone, if that's what you like. Sure, it did remove some of the bass, but that's kind of the intended purpose for those pedals, so kind of works still. So yeah, that allows you to get in the later 80s kind of tones, hair metal kind of thing. Right, super tight, super bright, really crispy, and still sounds like the bass amp, just with added gain and less bass. Another trick that you could do that's kind of similar here, just to alter the bass tone if you want to explore new territories, if that makes any sense. A lot of people would just put modulation in front of the amp, especially since older amps didn't really have effects loop like we do have today on modern amps. So basically pretty much the only way to connect pedals to an amp would just to connect them to the front input. So I'll just add that flanger here. As you can see, the rate is super high, so I guess the wave effect, if that makes any sense, won't be as drastic because it'll be super fast. So you won't hear the slow, the typical slow effect of a flanger, if that makes any sense. The mix is fairly high, and then level is as is, just some tweaks here. And what I like to use this with is when rolling the volume pot down, makes for very moody kind of clean tones, well, clean-ish tones. So it goes from being kind of dry sounding to more fun, more exciting, right? So just a quick snippet of that flanger at full volume on the guitar. See, so you can hear the flanger a little bit, but it's not crazy present. But yeah, you can still hear that wavy kind of effect. Then I'll turn my volume pot down just a bit and go into neck pickup. I'll play dry first so you get the idea of what it does. Then I'll turn that on. So it adds a lot of texture to your cleaner kind of tones, and it goes from being kind of, I wouldn't say boring, but definitely less exciting and textured than with the flanger on. For the rest of the preset here, I'll just turn that flanger off so we can explore the rest of the preset here. I've put an EQ, well, you know, as you may know, Podgo comes with some fixed blocks within each preset, so you kind of have to have that EQ block anyway, so might as well use it. And I've put a low-high shelf EQ here. If I turned that overdrive off, we're going to hear a bit more of what it does. But basically what I did is just turn off, just turn down some of the very low frequencies at 90 hertz here by minus 1.5 dB and didn't even touch the rest. So what it'll do is just take some of the kind of woofiness of the tone off. So I'm gonna play off, then turn it on. It'll be a really subtle change, but still important if you're recording or trying to have a bit more space in the mix, if that makes any sense. So without. And obviously I'm doing palm mutes because it highlights the low end a bit more. Then so without again. And with. So I don't know how well it will translate to this stream here, but we could notice, I could notice at least a little brighter kind of tone. Definitely remove some of the mud that I had with the bass tone. And then for the rest of the preset here, went with a classic kind of, once again, 80s digital delay here. I spaced the left and right repeats at similar intervals, so it kind of acts as just a repetition of the first one, if that makes any sense. And then the feedback and mix values are just dialed in so they can play together. So just. So almost analog, but it still keeps that very bright and loud characteristic of the repetitions for a digital delay. Gives a very arena rock kind of sound, in my opinion. And then the last effect here is the reverb. I just went, once again, kind of 80s classic plate. Obviously, I had to choose some models with whatever DSP limitations that I had because they are fairly populated presets. So I went with what I had, but classic plate. So just here. Almost going for a room kind of sound, but still super present and has a nice fade to it, very analog sounding, if you will. So yeah, so that's it for the first preset here, the 2204. We'll just switch to the next one here, which is based around the Princess amp. So this one will be kind of targeted to it basically replicates a sound that comes from my favorite albums from the 70s. So basically, even though it's going to be a high gain setting, they didn't really have many pedals available still. There were some fuzz circuits and stuff like that, but you didn't really have much in that department. So a trick that they did when in the studio, for example, they would just either crank the amps, but in the case of that amp model, it still doesn't yield a super high gain kind of tone. So let me just turn those off so we can hear. It's still going to be super clean. Like, it's not pristine clean, but compared to the previous preset, it is fairly clean. Even though the drive is all the way up and the channel volume is all the way up, I would need to crank the master to get a bit more drive out of it, but with those tricks that I'll be going over, it'll make for it. So with those, the trick to push the amp if you didn't have a pedal, and if you happen to find yourself in a studio, you could connect your guitar to a compressor, then crank its volume, and then send that to the amp. So that's how sometimes you would push amps back in the day, right? So I have two compressors here, which basically act as my gain stages. So the first one here will be this one. So the LA Studio Comp, both of them are the LA Studio Comp, and you'll see it's going to add a lot of gain. So mix is at 100%, gain is at 10. So I'm really going all out on this one. So once again, the bass tone. Just add this one here. So you can still hear that it's the amp, because compressors don't really affect the tone that much, especially this one. Uh, sure, it did squish the peaks, if that makes sense. So everything that I play too hard will be brought down, and everything that I play too soft will be brought up. So it evens out the sound a little bit, but the bass characteristic of the sound is still pretty much the same. Um, Pushed the amp a lot. Still kind of in the crunchy-ish territory. We're definitely not 80s high gain, but still a neat trick if you needed a bit more from the amp you had in the recording booth. So. And then most studios had many compressors on hand, so you could link them together and then once again get an extra push out of everything else. So if I play with just one on and then I'll turn the other one. See, so now we got really huge amounts of saturation while still sounding like the bass amp. But you just get so much more gain, and even though it's high gain levels, it's not the common what we commonly think as being high gain, right? It's just mainly for lead sounds, or if you want just a really blown out kind of tone. So if you needed an extra push for your solos, that'll be it for sure. And then another added benefit to that is that since you're using compressors, if you happen to find yourself in a recording setup, this would even out the sound and make it more recording ready, if you will. For this one, for the Princess amp, I went with the bass cabinet, so the 110. 84 ribbon, still kind of a darker-ish sounding mic. Pretty much on the cap edge once again. 0 degrees. A bit more in the low cut department compared to the first preset, so it doesn't get extra flubby, especially with those compressors on. And then the same high cut setting, because that's pretty much my go-to. Then if we go on the rest of the preset here, I tried to stay period correct, if that makes any sense. So I went with a transistor tape machine, so super analog. Almost kind of a slapback kind of thing. Fades out really quick, and the volume of the repetitions is fading as the repetitions happen. So really analog delay type stuff. And then I went with a spring type reverb, because that's pretty much what they had back in the days again. Once again, I had some limitations as to which reverb models I could use, but that still did the trick very well. So we can hear that classic spring reverb tone. So yeah, if you were a band in the 70s or even maybe the 60s, depending on the equipment at the time, that would have been a way to push your amp in the next gain stage, because the amps themselves didn't have them. There wasn't such a need for higher gain amps back in the days. So that's a neat trick that pretty much you could only do in studio, but then you would find other ways live, and then pedals came to be. So that helped a lot of people replicate their sounds in the live environment. I think we've got a question or a comment here. Let me just show that up. Giovanni saying that they love the Mandarin amp and cab. However, how can we make a distortion sound brighter? Because it's a bit muddy, most of the distortion in it. Okay, so if there are a couple ways to do that, a good example would be what I did with the 2204 preset here. The bass tone was fairly bassy, so I'm gonna do some palm mutes because it's going to highlight that. And then what I did with this one is I added the Super Odie here, and then that really tightens up the low end. So once again, without, then with. So that's one way to do it. Then another way to do it here would be with those blocks, the low and high shelf blocks. You could just select a different low frequency here. Between 2 and 300 hertz is usually where the mud is. So anywhere in that ballpark, and then just turn the gain a bit down. That would be pretty efficient as well. So I'll try that here right now. So I'll turn that off. See how it kept everything else the same, but just removed some of that super low end that makes your sound a bit muddy if you have too much of it, for sure. So that would be a neat trick, either adding one of those overdrives or that low and high shelf EQ block if you happen to have another overdrive already and you don't have other blocks available. That EQ block could help you in that regard. Cool. So we'll go to the third preset here that I have for today. Kind of staying in the same era. So I went with the Line 6 electric amp, and I have a pitch shifter on here just so we can enhance the low end and replicate the tuning of the kind of band and era I was going for. But that's kind of British late 60s, if that makes any sense. You'll totally get it once I start playing. So Line 6 electric, lower drive settings, low bass settings, mid and treble is almost halfway up, presence is fairly high at 6 in comparison to the other ones, and then volume and master are fairly high, so I can get a bit of saturation out of the amp. So let's just give that a whirl. Oh, and then sag is up here as well, so I can get a bit more compression and squish. So, like I was saying while talking about the previous preset, in the 60s and 70s there weren't too many pedals around if you needed an extra push from your amp. But they had some fuzz circuits, some wahs and stuff like that, but I'm mostly talking about overdrives and stuff. There mostly were only fuzzes around. So I'm going for that kind of really heavy, kind of almost doomy, sludgy kind of early 70s kind of metal tone. So I'm adding the Alpaca Rouge drive here, which is kind of a fuzz-ish. But I turned the high cut way down so it doesn't get too bassy, or at least keeps some of the highs, right? Because it's a really bassy drive by itself. So I didn't, and the amp was also kind of bassy, so I didn't want to add too much to it. So yeah, it gives a great push and really pushes you in that sonic territory. So that type of flavor, if you will. Once again, try to stay period correct. So the cab is a 412 with the blackback speakers. Went with the 121 mic. It's a fairly smooth sounding mic. Tons of bass to it, but keeps a brightness a bit more than the previous two, so the 84 and the 4038. It's a bit past the cap edge because the blackback speakers were very bright. Similar settings for the rest, 0 degrees, 90 hertz on the low cut, and 7 kilohertz on the high cut. So I don't get the super sparkly fizzy high end, because that's pretty much reflective of an actual speaker's frequency range, right? So yeah, so that's the amp and speaker setup. To remove some of the bass, because it's really bassy right now, I did the trick that I was talking about with the 2204 here, but I placed the EQ block before the overdrive, so it cuts a bit more bass, and it doesn't cut the amp space, but your signal space rather. Makes a bit of a difference for sure, the placement of that EQ block. So once again, off. So remove some of the mud, but still keeps that bass tone intact and helps regain some of the highs that we kind of lost with that overdrive being so bassy, right? The amp itself is fairly bassy too, and then I went for bassier kind of settings on the mic placement, so you had to you have to gain some back somewhere. So yeah, it's a neat trick to keep that tone, but remove some of the mud to make it more mix friendly, if that makes any sense. It still keeps everything else. Then to complete the rest of the preset here, once again staying in that era of the 60s and 70s, they didn't have much in terms of delays and reverbs, so I kept the transistor tape with different settings. Kind of a slapback, but way darker sounding than the previous preset, the Princeton here. So still kind of used in the same way, but a bit more tamed. And then I went with the the dynamic ambiance reverb model, which is kind of a room kind of reverb. So I went with the biggest room size, damping at 5 kilohertz, so it's not too bright, because it wouldn't really make sense to have a room sound be bright. And then the rest of the setting is pretty much stock. I set the high cut to the same value as my cap block, so it doesn't add some top end that I wouldn't want. And then low cut is so it doesn't get too muddy once again. So almost can't hear it, but once you turn it off, then you can feel that it's not there. So it's a feel reverb is what I like to call those room sounds. So it doesn't really muddy up your tone and still fits in a mix, but gives you that feel that really helps when going direct, for example, because I'm going straight to an interface right now and through studio monitors. So there's not much in the there's no big cab to push air around and stuff like that, so it helps having kind of a live kind of feel to it. So I'll go to my last preset, and then we'll pretty much be that'll pretty much be it for today. And that's kind of a curveball, because on this one, even though it says 90s, I didn't go the typical 90s route. You think kind of the Cali amps for the 90s, super modern, super bassy, kind of mid-scoop kind of tones. But there's kind of another side to it. In the more underground scenes, if that makes any sense, they were using a lot of solid state amps. So there aren't many of them in the guitar side for the amp models in Podgo. So I went with a bass amp that I'm kind of treating like a guitar amp. So I went with the G Cougar 800, which is formidable bass amp, but if you go straight without any overdrives, it's a clean amp, basically. So what I did to replicate those solid state guitar amps of the 90s that I'm thinking about is add another kind of typical 90s overdrive. In the legacy models here, I've added the heavy distortion, but I turned the treble way down because it's a very trebly overdrive, and it would sound fizzy real quick and really razor sharp, if that makes any sense. So I'm going from clean to... So I'm keeping the solid state character of the amp, but I'm transforming it in a guitar amp with that heavy distortion and really bright sounding as well. For the cab, I went with a guitar cab, so it makes a bit of sense, because if I went bass cab, that would have been a bit much. Went with the XXL V30 cab, kind of typical of its era, if that makes any sense. 160 ribbon mic, edge of the cap, then classic 0 degrees. Low cut set a bit down because it wasn't that bassy of an amp, and especially with the overdrive added, and then the high cut is set at 7 kilohertz once again. With this one, what I did is I added the tilt EQ, and that's kind of my rhythm sound. So usually it would have been on from the get-go, just because I'm scrolling through everything at once here. But yeah, that would be my rhythm sound. So it's turned 1.5 decibels down, and then once I turn it off, that kind of would be my lead sound. So yeah, so that's a bit darker as well with the tilt EQ added. Then if I turn it back off, it'll be brighter. And what's funny to me is that it doesn't really sound like a tube amp, but doesn't mean that it sounds bad, right? When set right, so in that case, kind of an untraditional EQ setting, if you think about normal EQ curves with the treble set way down, but if you set things the right way, you can make a lot of things sound pretty good. So a lot of bands were able to get around with those older solid state amps back in the day, but with just the right tricks, right? And the EQ in that heavy distortion is really powerful. So that's a way to really shape the sound and have something that sounds decent with a really unconventional setup. Just turn that off. So really cool, kind of really tight, and really mid-forward high gain tone. And yeah, so for the rest of the preset, I went with a chorus. If you wanted something a bit more grungy, if you will, turn that on to a neck pickup or something like that. Or on the case of my Revstar, I have the focus switch here. With the really wet kind of setting, so mix is at 50%, so it's really present. The depth is almost all the way up again, so yeah, it makes for a really chorusy kind of tone. And then when transistor tape, we've heard it before, but just a quick glimpse. Went with a bit more repeats, but still very analog, and then classic dynamic hall reverb to give some extra effect. So yeah, using the tilt EQ in that case toggles from the rhythm and lead sounds and pushes and a really unconventional amp into, with the help of that distortion here, into guitar territory. So yeah, that's pretty much all my presets for today. Thanks for everyone that watched live, and thanks to everyone who will be watching later. Hope I answered most questions here, and yeah, thanks again for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.